question is about the CCP has all these lies about Tibet, right? And one of the things that they've said is that Tibet was never its own country. And they go back to the Yuan dynasty.
13th century.
Right. So in the 13th century, the Chinese government, which was actually the Mongolians who had invaded under Genghis Khan, but those maps from what I've seen, what they've said is that those included Tibet, and there was some marriage there that solidified this. So, and then since then, Tibet has always been part of Chinese territory since ancient times.
Well, ironically, during the Yuan dynasty, China itself was under occupation. So the dynasty at that time decided to settle in China. But the Chinese were themselves occupied. And Tibet as a nation, we had our own share of occupation under Mongolia, but we were freed after that. China was not freed. They were under the occupation. And right now, the irony lies in the fact that they choose to, at least for now, accept the Mongolian leaders as Chinese, to claim that from the 13th century Yuan dynasty, and they also wouldn't stop quoting the Qing dynasty as well, and say that even in the 17th century of Qing dynasty, Tibet was part of China. No, it was not. They were not Chinese themselves, So I think this is very CCP, where manipulation and a very, propaganda that benefits them, they always tend to use that. And even so-called scholars of CCP, their mouthpiece, they choose to quote Yuan dynasty and 13th century. It's completely made up. And I always say that, on that cases, it's like Australia claiming over New Zealand just because, Britain rule over both of them. It does not make sense when you were both occupied that time. So for me, it just does not make sense. But apparently their propaganda is able to manipulate a huge portion of the population around the world.
I think it's maybe you should have a conversation with the Southern Mongolians that, you go back to the Yuan dynasty maps and then you guys take historical Tibet and then they can take the rest of China under the CCP's own logic, right? Yeah.
Well, that's why you don't have debates with communists.
The Manchus can do the same thing about the 17th century itself again, right?
Well, there's not a lot of Manchus left.
I know, because they ruled over China again in 17th century. And, CCP also quote the Manchu dynasty of Qing. So,
but did the Manchus administer Tibet?
It was relatively for a short time. But then again, considering the fact that it was also a very Buddhist nation and Tibet being a Buddhist nation, they decided that, okay, you can be free again. So I think we were able to free ourselves entirely because of Buddhism, but not China. Just that they had a change of government, but it was the same, colonizers from outside that ruled over China. So we have never had a Han Chinese ruler who ruled over Tibet.
So in the Ming dynasty, it was not at all under Chinese
Absolutely
rule?
not. Absolutely not.
Okay.
They hadn't ruled Tibet. That's why they are choosing to quote the Yuan and Qing dynasty. Ironically, they are both not Chinese. They're both outsiders.
And I also noticed there's this propaganda going on now in Chinese state-run media where they, in English, have stopped using the word Tibet.
Oh, yes.
Like they just say Xizang, which is the Chinese word for Tibet, anytime they have to talk about Tibet in English language state-run media. So it's almost like they're not just erasing historical Tibet and saying Tibet autonomous region. It's like now it's not even Tibet anymore. It's just Xizang.
Yeah. And they're actually using that. We've seen actually different medias, even in India, use Xizang. It's strange because China is doing same thing to some of the regions of India where they claim that it's part of China. And they have, again, completely changed it to a name that China associates it with. So, yes, China never fails through its propaganda to use different medium, including media, to spread out that kind of fake information.
I guess I have another question about the future of Tibet. Should it gain autonomy or the Chinese Communist Party disappears? This will involve a lot of, one, the Tibetan government in exile moving back, as well as probably Tibetans from all over the world, people who maybe have never actually been to Tibet.
Like myself.
Like yourself. And again, you're going to have this issue of like, there's people who have been living in Tibet all along, some ethnically Tibetan, some ethnically Chinese.
Like, will they accept you?
I don't see a reason why they wouldn't, because Tibet is a huge 2.5 square million kilometer we're talking about. It's a massive land. One of the reasons why China continues to hold power over. And there's enough, more than enough land for everyone, each one of us, to go back and to have actually more people come in to Tibet. So I don't think that is a problem at all. Certainly, in terms of adjusting ourselves to this Tibet or the Tibetanness that we are accustomed to, that'll take time. But I don't see any other reason why we would have any form of problem. The fact that it'll be a rejuvenation in a way in terms of nation building that time, it'll certainly be difficult administrative wise. But other than that, I don't see a problem why this less than 2% Tibetans around the free world in diaspora returning back to the fatherland could be a problem at all to the 98%.
Right, but in terms of government, right, that maybe people who've been living in Tibet for generations, they see that, oh, well, there's this foreign government that's been in India, and none of those parliament members were even born here. So now they want to come to where I live and say that they're in charge?
The paradox is the fact that Tibetans inside Tibet, for generations, they've been waiting for us to come back. We've had protests, we've had self-immolations, Tibetans burning themselves. We had various forms of protests against Chinese Communist Party solely to see a reunification is the term that they use. To see a reunification of Tibetan people, and the return of the 14th Dalai Lama. So I think the fact that we could return, we could see His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama back in Potala Palace where he left Tibet from, it'll be a huge historical event which they have been waiting for several generations. So it'll be completely opposite. I think we'll have perhaps whole year of celebrations when we return back. This is how I see it.
I mean, I guess this is one of the differences between, again, the Uyghurs and the Hong Kong communities, that you do have the legitimacy granted to you by the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
And I think also, it's almost like, when you said that, it struck me as that it's almost like the opposite of what's happening with Taiwan, where like the CCP wants to use all of this propaganda about reunification, that like, oh, they have like propaganda songs about like, we'll be taking the train to Taiwan and like everybody will be happy together. Like,
Hold on, the train to Taiwan?
Yes, it's weird, right? But like it was an actual like propaganda song that a few years ago. Anyway, so the idea is like they want to push is the idea that this will be one big happy family. But it's essentially that is not what the Taiwanese people want at all. Like nobody in there is like, yay, come right. CCP.
It'll be a family, but not all families are happy.
Right. So it's interesting that our perception of what that's going to be, and like what you're saying about Tibet is kind of like what the CCP wants people to believe about the Taiwan issue.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one example that I can give you is in the early 80s, when during Deng Xiaoping's time, when he agreed that we could have the first delegation of the Dalai Lama to visit Tibet, I think their imagination and understanding was the fact that when those delegations visit Tibet, there'll be protests against them. So they were actually the CCP officials and individuals on the street. They were telling Tibetans, "Okay, calm down, don't harm them," right? But when they actually went on street, they pounced on the Tibetans, crying, telling them, "We want you to come back." So this is an image that CCP hasn't, envisaged, and I don't think they want to see that again. And they're very uncomfortable about that fact. And I believe even if we do something like this today in occupied Tibet, we'll have a same response, or perhaps a bigger, more emotional response from the Tibetans inside Tibet.
I'd never heard of that. It's one of the many things that happened in the 1980s that was covered up.
Absolutely. And this is how we have had many entourages and delegation of Tibet visit, the occupied Tibet. where they were trying to understand what Tibetans inside Tibet think or how they're living. Because that time CCP was saying, okay, everything's going, jolly well in Tibet. So you can just see, how everything's fine. You can come back to Tibet too, right? So this is what they wanted Tibetans inside Tibet to witness as well. So when they actually went, there were Tibetans wailing out. I think it'll be interesting if you show the image while we are talking on screen. I'll be more than happy to send it to you, where Tibetans are just like, crying out there, like a huge number on the street of Lhasa joining just to see a glimpse of them. Because they've said that you have been next and close to the Dalai Lama, that you have touched him, you have been blessed by him. Allow us to touch you as well. I'm not sure if that sounds, quite legal, but that was the emotion of the Tibetans, right? This is how they saw us. They saw the Tibetan government in exile. And this is certainly not something that CCP wants to see.
Well, that must be terrifying for the CCP.
Absolutely.
Because they don't even understand this emotional connection that people could have with the Dalai Lama, especially after all the things that they've said about the Dalai Lama, and probably things many party members believe about the Dalai Lama.